Good afternoon, everyone. Today is the state of the bird for the third quarter of 2022. This one we've subtitled GTK4. We made it. So let's get right into it. So for those of you that aren't aware, the state of the bird is a presentation to explain what's going on in the project. Pidgin 3's development has been very long. So to try to actually let people know that we're still working on it, what's going on with the project, stuff like that. We do these quarterly updates so that people can, just check in, find the videos on YouTube, whatever, right? Rather than trying to keep up with the day-to-day of what's actually going on inside of the project. Because it's a lot and it's way too much for people to keep track of, let alone me. But more than that, it's also an interactive event for the community. One of the things you'll notice is down below this presentation on the stream, there is a note there that says if you have any questions, you can type !ask and then your question. After I get through the presentation, I will go through and answer all those questions. So if you have a question about Pidgin 3's development or even Pidgin 2, what's going on there, or any of our infrastructure or anything like that, this is a good time to ask that because I will respond to directly and all of that. So, all right, next up, let's talk about the retrospective. What's happened from July to the end of September? So we had our last State of the Bird on July 21st. That one we talked about how we are continuing our GTK4 port, and I don't remember what else. I should have reviewed it. But our next one is tentatively scheduled for January 19th of 2023. We tend to schedule these for the third week into the quarter. It seems to work well for us. So yeah. All right. Let's get into some metrics. So metrics we added either last Day of the Bird or the one before, I can't remember. These just try to give you a high level of what's going on, right? So in Q2, when it comes to review requests, those are pull requests or merge requests, depending on which terminology you use. It's somebody submitted something for review to be accepted into the project. In Q2, we opened 135 pull requests, review requests. But here in Q3, we opened 358. So you can tell a lot of development has happened in Q3. In Q2, we closed 148 review requests, but in Q3, we closed 357. So if you're keeping track here, in Q2, we were positive 13 pull requests. That means there must have been some leftover from Q1 that got closed at the start of Q2, and that's how we were positive for how many we netted. Whereas in Q3, we, aside from these numbers being doubled, we basically closed everything we opened. And in Q2 we had 7 contributors across those 135 review requests, and in Q3 over those 358 review requests we had 4 contributors. So obviously you can see we definitely ramped up a lot of development because we did twice as much work with half as many people. So lots and lots of stuff going on there. All right, next up we've got issues. Issues are our issue tracker that you can find at issues.im.freedom.org. And in Q2 we had 27 opened issues. Most of those were end users with issues in Pidgin 2, stuff like that, right? In Q3, we opened 52 issues. One of the big things I've been doing differently in Q3, and a little bit in Q2, I think, too, is I've been trying to make sure that... sorry, that was my sound. I've been trying to make sure that I create issues for everything before I start implementing them, because a lot of the times I start taking on these very complicated projects, and I just start winging it, right? And what ends up happening is I end up spending a lot of time unwinding stuff and figuring it out as I'm going, rather than just sitting down at first and working through a lot of those details and then proceeding. So by using issues for it, number one, people can see stuff moving around in the issue tracker, stuff like that. But number two, it makes me take the time to work out what should happen and why it should happen. There's a bunch of examples we'll get into, but that's just kind of what's going on there. But likewise, again, in Q2 we closed 14 issues, and in Q3 we closed 27. Again, you're going to notice the numbers are just about twice as much. So the Q3 we really started hammering stuff home. You can just see that in the metrics alone. All right, when it comes to commits, these are how many commits to each repository. For Pidgin 2, Pidgin 3, it's the same repository, so we're looking at the branches, right? So for Pidgin 2, we're looking at the release 2.x.y branch. For Pidgin 3, we're looking at the default branch. So in Q2, we had 39 commits on Pidgin 2. In Q3, we only had 4. We'll get more into that in a little bit, but you can very clearly see by the Pidgin 3 commits that our focus has been almost entirely on Pidgin 3. Because in Q2, we only had 82 commits, and in Q3, we had 248, right? So this one's tripled. All the other numbers doubled, this one tripled. But yeah, so G plugin, again, we didn't do a whole lot on G plugin in Q2. We can explain more on G plugin and Talk2 in a little bit. There's another slide where we'll cover some of it. But G plugin is our plugin library. That's a separate repository that people can use in their applications and so on. But in Q2, we only had 2 commits, and in Q3, we had 28 commits. The vast majority of all of these commits were either GTK4 related or just other random cleanups and stuff with the transition to GTK4. Then Talk2 is our library for our new chat widgets. That's like our history, our input, those kind of things. Those things are very complicated widgets to write. So we decided we were going to try to make them reusable so other people could use them too. We're still deciding if it's going to stay that way because it doesn't seem like there's going to be much buy-in to do it, and it's really complicated to do it the way it is right now. But anyway, so in Q2, we didn't have any changes on Talk2, and in Q3, we had 18 commits. Again, that was all GTK4 related, well, for the most part. There's one thing that was us trying out a new tool that was not GTK4 related. But yeah, all right. Next up, infrastructure. So we shut down wiki.im.freedom.org, and we replaced it with kb.imfreedom.org. KB stands for knowledge base. I can't remember if I put a domain alias in there or not. I should check that. I was going to do knowledgebase.imfreedom.org, but I was like, nobody's going to type that. So I might not have created it. But the reason we shut down wiki.imfreedom.org is that was a MediaWiki instance, which was MediaWiki's relatively heavy in the sense that you could run it with another HTTP server, but we were running it with Apache. It uses mod PHP. That's not problematic for us. I mean, it's what runs Wikipedia, right? It's fine. The bigger issue is that it also required a database. So inside the Kubernetes cluster, we had this instance plus a database plus multiple volumes, one for the database, one for like file upload, stuff like that to MediaWiki. And that just kind of sucked, especially since I shouldn't say nobody, but in our case, nobody was using the wiki to update stuff except for basically me. So the decision was made to replace everything with a make docs site, and then just follow our normal pull request review request contribution workflow, right? Because then that way we can just run multiple copies of a static site for redundancy, and we can cut down our resource usage by a lot. I don't know, we'll say at least 4 times. So we're also in the process of still doing this with our track instance. We're migrating most of track into our main website. We didn't really do much with that at all this quarter. But we did update the tracking data so we can do the same thing, because track also uses a ton of resources in the cluster. And if we can free some of those up, better, right? That's less stuff we have to maintain and worry about. So, all right. So, JetBrains has renewed our open source licenses for UTrack and TeamCity. So we use UTrack for our issue tracker at issues.imfreedom.org, and we use TeamCity for our continuous integration at ci.imfreedom.org. We don't have UTrack, or not UTrack, we don't have TeamCity open to the public because I'm not sure exactly how to secure it well. And like at first, when we first stood it up, I had it open to the public, and people were running personalized builds, which is something I didn't realize they could do. So all of a sudden, people were making our build agents do stuff with like when they shouldn't have. So anyways, that's completely off the point. Anyways, so we use that for dealing with those issues and our CI stuff. And JetBrains has graciously renewed our licenses for that. So it's just update and to thank them for it. So now some of the bad news. Our email is still running at Wiktel. For those of you that haven't been keeping track, it's been a year, or has it been 2 years now? I don't even remember. That's how long it's been. Of how long I've been trying to migrate our email. Honestly, I haven't done a lot of work on it because when I think of things to work on, this is just something I don't want to work on. It sucks. It's horrible. Standing up and maintaining your own email server might be cool once or twice, but when you're doing it as like production environment for your project that you'd rather code on, it's really hard to find motivation. But that said, so we got into this a little too late. I was hoping to get through a lot of this in August, and we just started really pushing on the GTK4 stuff, so this just took a backseat. So over the past couple of weeks, we've been devising a plan to offload our email sending and receiving to an external provider. We're currently looking at Mailgun, because for basically about the cost of $1 a day, email becomes not my problem, which is worth every single penny of that. So we're also going to look at, I think it's Fast Mail. I'm not sure if they're going to work. I know that Mailgun does just about everything we need. I have to verify some things yet, but it does SMTP relay as well as incoming matching rules. So like we could still have I could still have my grim@pidgin.im email address and just have it forwarded to my normal address. But when it comes to the mailing list, we're going to move all of that to Discourse. This has been a touchy topic, at least on our support mailing list. Basically, they just want to still be able to use email, which we're supposed to be able to do with Discourse. But we're going to have to figure out what's going on there and how to make that work exactly. The plan for the archives, because our archives alone, not counting the ones on SourceForge, are they go back to 2007, so it's about 15 years. What we might do is, if we absolutely have to, we'll write something to basically just make it work, because right now all of the archives are just in an mbox file format, which is it's standard format. There's nothing to it. But the current way that they're handled is via a CGI bin process called Pipermail, which comes from the Mailman project version 2. Version 2 is deprecated. They're not supporting it anymore. So I don't really want to deploy that as our long-term archives, right? So what we might do is, like I said, if we have to, it wouldn't be very difficult to write something in Go. That can just, take the URL, use that to figure out which mailing list you're on, use that to figure out, and then use that to figure out the dates and everything, or to generate indexes and everything based on the mboxes that are available, and just go from there, right? That wouldn't be that hard. That said, if I don't have to create something, I don't want to create something because I got other things to write, but we'll see what happens, right? Those are all things that we're going to get to and go from there. So next up, we tore down the Weblate deployment that we had started standing up. So I think we mentioned this in a previous State of the Bird, where so right now we currently use Transifex for interacting with our translators. And we were planning to move off of Transifex because that's one of the only things where we don't self-host. And Weblate seemed like a good idea, for a number of reasons. We ran into some silly issues with deploying it. Not huge issues. They're still unresolved. But I during this quarter I did reach out to all of the translators on Transifex and found out that many of them are still there and active. That was our main concern, was that like there's people that are still connected to the project but they're just not doing anything, or they're just here, they're not, you know they've moved on, but they're still like listed as like the maintainer of the language and stuff like that, right? But I reached out to a bunch of them, found out there's still quite a few people there. um, we maybe don't have full coverage, but that's okay, right? We'll get that solved as we get there. Um, but basically, it turns out that we're just not going to use Weblate, right? We're just going to use Transifex. It's the tools everybody knows, and we're just going to keep going that way. So I tore down the resources we had left standing up for Weblate. Basically, we had everything still running except for the web app itself. Because the main issue was we were trying to integrate it with our single sign-on provider, but that was problematic. We couldn't make it work on a custom one because of just the way that Django social auth works. So that was silly, and that was what was blocking us. But now we're just going to use Transifex anyway, so we just got rid of it. All right. Finally, we updated review board to review board version 5.0. The main driver for that was that they added SAML authentication now. So we had integration with our single sign-on provider, but that was done via a plugin that I wrote for review board. Now, I'm not saying the code I wrote is garbage, but I'm saying I definitely didn't keep an eye on it, and I don't think it's as robust as it could have been. So moving to SAML, which is an industry-wide standard, right? And we were able to set up SAML in JetBrains Hub. JetBrains Hub is the single sign-on provider we use. We use it because it obviously integrates with UTrack and TeamCity. Yeah, so just setting up SAML there and then pointing a review board to it, and we were done. So that was, good time. Everything's there, it's working. And now we're not using my plugin where I had to make weird assumptions. Although that's not true. We also had to patch review board to deal with an assumption. UTrack or Hub, JetBrains Hub, realizes that names are complicated. So instead of having a first name and last name field, you get a single name. You get a full name field. Because some people have one name, some people have multiple parts of a last name, some people have, whatever, right? Review board is tied to the Django user model, and that has a first name, last name, because that dates back to like 2004 or something, before people really started understanding that problem, right? So we wrote the plugin I wrote for the review board stuff long ago. We had some code in there that would check, or that would take the hub username and try to split it on the first space and then make that a first name, last name, or fall back to just a last name or something. I don't remember. I'd have to look. But we did submit that upstream to review board, and they did apply it. So that's how we got the SAML authentication working. All right, next up, Pidgin 2. We didn't release anything. As you saw from the metrics, we didn't do much of anything on Pidgin 2 at all this quarter. That's good or bad? In my opinion, that's good. We didn't have any big issues that were affecting people. So we didn't have to do like any emergency fixes or anything. So it's just there, it's stable. It let us focus on Pidgin 3, right? Also, we haven't done anything on the Google OSS Fuzz. I've been trying to get to this over the past 2 weeks, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. Our build has been failing for a while, at least the 2 weeks. And we need to go through and figure that out and get that going. So for those of you that don't know, Google OSS Fuzz is a service Google provides to open source projects. And basically what it does is it will fuzz your program. And what does that mean? Well, fuzzing a program is basically you write a unit test that will go to like that'll run the more sensitive parts of your code. Let's go with that. But what it'll do is it will go through and give it random input values. Now the values aren't exactly random. It'll start out kind of random, but then what it'll do is it'll see that it hit multiple code paths and stuff like that, and it'll keep mutating it so that you eventually hit all the different code paths and stuff like that. And this is useful because this is useful especially in a network-based application where you can't necessarily validate all your incoming data, or like, even though like, oh, you say, you know, you're on HTTP, you're only supposed to get 7-bit ASCII or something, right? I know it's not the case, right? I'm this example is contrived. There's nothing really to stop somebody from giving you binary data in that stream too, and if your program doesn't handle that well, that can lead to crashes, which can lead to exploits, which can lead to security issues, right? So Google OSS Fuzz helps you do this preemptively to kind of figure that out. So think of it as kind of like CI, but like CI for security, kind of, and stability. And that's one of the reasons why we need to get this going. We set this up last year, I think it was, when Zero Diem had a bounty on us. But we just haven't done a whole lot with it because time, time and lack of resources, right? Our Achilles heels. So, all right, next up, Pidgin 3. So Pidgin 3 got split into 2 slides this time because there's been that much stuff. So we're going to start off talking about what we did to increase maintainability, right? So the first thing we did, or the first thing is we removed many signals and their unused marshalers. So signals are, for those of you that aren't aware, are basically an implementation of the observer design pattern. It's basically somebody says, hey, I want to know when this thing happens, and then when this thing happens, it goes through those list of things and tells them, right? That's the signal. Signal emits it, puts it out, blah, blah, blah. That was very simple. I hope that made sense. But so before we really adopted GObject or glib and GObject, libpurple had its own signaling system, and it still does. And it's integrated into everything. But as we're slowly migrating things to GObjects are where you implement your signals in glib. We're slowly transitioning stuff to use those GObject signals. This is something that we're going to be doing until 3.0.0 final is released, right? But so what we did is this is the first time we went through and found out which signals weren't actually being consumed anymore, deleted them, and then figured out which marshalers were being used by the signals and deleted those. A marshaler is, I mean, you've probably seen this if you've done any sort of serialization or of data going across wires, stuff like that, right? A marshaler in the signal sense, at least in the C programming language, it's a function. So like in C, everything's statically typed. So you've got to, like, when you define a function pointer, you have to have a type. Well, you don't have to have a type, but you have to give a signature for it. A marshaler is basically a function pointer that defines what the function that's being called should look like for a signal. So this is just really complicated stuff that not many people are very strong with, right? And us being able to get rid of our own implementation of this is just good, because it's hard to maintain, it's confusing to learn, and there's better options given to us or afforded to us by glib and GObject. So getting rid of this is a good win all around. We still have a lot of work to do. Like I said, we're still going to be doing this until we've got every single thing converted, but that's a big win right there. All right, next up, we added a bunch of introspection wrappers and marked them as such. So the introspection stuff here is the GObject introspection. That is the tool that basically will read through our API and declare it and create a definition of that API so that it can be implemented in other languages, right? That's where the introspection part of it comes through. However, there's certain things that you like to do in C and other native languages because they make it easier to write. For example, passing a variable number of arguments to a function. And the way that's done in C and C++ are very different from, say, the way it's done in Python, right? Python, you use a star args as an argument, which will just automatically zip any arguments together into a tuple. Whereas in C, you have to use this structure called a var list and a whole bunch of other crap. So in the C way, we'd like to use those because it makes things easy. But when it comes to the introspection stuff, we obviously can't use that in Python or Lua or whatever, because those structures don't exist in those languages. That doesn't make sense syntactically. So what we do is Geometry Introspection, the tool that actually builds that that definition, we can give it hints to say to skip those C specific functions. But then what we can do is we wrote other implementations that work for those other languages, and we can then tell Geometry Introspection to rename those functions to the original function name. So what ends up happening is the namespace in C is fine. You know, they're different names, but like in Python, you'd call purple debug info. It's a bad example, but it works. Instead of purple debug info args or something, which is what the actual C function name is. And then that way, like if we wanted to from C, we could call the args version. But what it'll end up doing is instead it'll take like a list of parameters rather than a va list, right? A list being like a G list or a G list model, something like that, that will is much more compatible with the higher level languages. All right, I hope that covered that. So next up, we removed a ton of now unused utility functions. Anybody who is a regular on the stream has surely heard me complain, or I should say rant, about don't ever create utility files because they will become a dumping ground for everything. And yeah, that's what happens. So we've now been able to remove a bunch of utility functions because Pidgin 2 and earlier, all of the UI was built via code. Right, so it was like GTK window new, GTK window or GTK widget add widget, blah blah blah, and we'd build everything procedurally line by line, right, in C code. So what ended up happening is a lot of utility functions got built to make that process easier. Well, now nearly everything is moved to GTK Builder. Not quite everything, but we're definitely past 50%, probably about 75%. And that in doing so, we've been able to remove all those utility functions that were for that specific reason. There's a bunch of other stuff we've been able to get rid of. I can't recall what off the top of my head. Some of them were like URL parsing, stuff like that, because glib has options for it now when it didn't 20 years ago or something, and we just never updated to it, right? So a lot of that stuff has been removed for that kind of reasons. All right, next up, remove private structures from any objects that are final types. So in the OOP world, it's not uncommon to have a class that is a final class, which basically means you cannot subclass it. So in the G-object world, the way inheritance works is we compose structures together to create, so that subclasses have a full copy of their parent, stuff like that. It's getting way too much into the implementation details. But anyways, so what ends up happening is if a class is public, the size of that struct has to be known and it can't change, right? Because if it changes, you're going to break API or application, or more specifically, you're going to break ABI, application binary interface. So like if somebody compiled against you on version 1.0 and then you change it in 1.1, that version's no longer, that plugin or whoever subclassed it, that's going to be broken and have to recompile, right? That's what ABI means. You have to recompile to fix things when you break ABI. So to avoid that, glib has a bunch of helpers and everything to make things easier for that. But in doing so, when something's public, you end up having to create a private structure to hold all your instance data, right? All your private instance data. The problem is a lot of our objects that were already final were created with those private data types, which it's not a huge deal, but it ends up making a lot of things take like 2 extra steps than it should. So by removing those private structures, so when something's final, we don't have to, that structure with all the instance data doesn't have to be public anymore. So you can just use it directly in your C code and you don't have to go through those extra steps. So by removing those private structures, we remove the step to get the private data and then access the private data, and it just becomes access the private data. So we did that through a bunch of our structures that were already final, and that just simplified the readability of the code, and it just made less code to read and write. So that's a win all around. Now, obviously, if we have to make those if we have to make those public in the future, we have to go through and make that change again. But it's not a huge change to do. It's a little annoying and tedious, but it's a one-time thing, so it's not the end of the world, right? And usually, when you're making something public after it's been private for a while, you really kind of understand how it's going to work and stuff like that. So you're making a big change regardless. So, all right, the next topic is very technical, and I'm going to do my best to try to not make it super technical. So we moved many struct initializations to use struct initializers. You're probably going, what in the heck does that mean? Well, in C, before the C99 specification, which I told you it's going to be technical, bear with me. Before the C99 specification, if you wanted to initialize a structure, you had to provide all of the values in order that you wanted to initialize. Now, you didn't necessarily have to get every argument in the structure, but those values that you didn't grab would possibly be set to uninitialized memory, right? So you wouldn't know what they are. So because Pidgin and game before it predates GCC, at least supporting the C99 specification, we had structs being, we had instances of structs being initialized throughout the code base that way, right? So you would see this a lot where, especially in like plugins and stuff, where you'd have to like define a plugin info structure, and it would be like ID, or it'd be like some string, comma, comment, the ID of the plugin. Next line, name, or this is my plugin, comma, comment, this is the name of the plugin, right? And it'd all be broken down like that, just so like people could understand which parameter, what the value they saw, what parameter it was for. But now, since we're targeting at least C99, because it's 2022 now, and C99 has been implemented mostly everywhere. I'm pretty sure it's in Visual Studio, but I'm not positive. Because of that, now we're using struct initializers. So what happens now is, instead of just a variable comma, variable comma, variable comma, we now will say something like .id equals my plugin ID, comma, next line, .name equals my plugin, right? This way we don't have to have the comments off to the side keeping track of the things anymore, and people can, just the way the code reads will tell you exactly what's happening, right? There's no more just, I don't know, parameter 4 changed, I have to go figure out which plugins are broke, and I won't have a compile time check, right? Or I might have a compile time check, but it's going to be really hard to understand. Whereas now, if it would be like, .id expected car star got int, right? And you're like, oh, something's clearly wrong. Let me go fix that, right? But more importantly than that is struct initializers by default, as part of the spec, I'm pretty sure. I have to double check, but I don't really care because it just seems to work fine in GCC. Anything that you don't set explicitly via struct initializer will be zeroed out. So like if you have a pointer to something, it's just null, right? You don't have to sit there and do null, null, null for all the stuff anymore. It's just there. So yeah. All right, one of the next things, we moved all of the plugins to individual subdirectories. So the reasons for this are, as we continue to adopt more of the GNOME stuff and stop using so much of our own specific code, especially stuff like preferences and templates for building UIs and stuff like that, what ends up happening is plugins end up becoming multiple files. Not even multiple source files, right? But if we're going to use G settings, that's the stuff to use instead of our preferences, we're going to have a schema file that gets embedded into the plugin. We want that schema file to sit next to the plugin, but we also don't want it to be lost in a sea of files. Likewise, the UI files, the UI definitions, if we're going to use GTK Builder, those also are a separate file. And again, we don't want to have just a directory that's full of source files and UI files and all that. That's hard to follow, hard to find stuff, right? So because of these reasons, we've moved all the plugins to subdirectories. There's still a couple plugins that are just a single C file, and that's fine, right? It's not a big deal. But for the ones that have like multiple C files, plus multiple UI files, plus a schema file, all that, now they're just all encapsulated in their own directory and they can do their own thing. One of the reasons why we didn't do this earlier is due to the way that Make this, the tool we used to use to build the program previously, can only work on a directory at a time. So if you have a bunch of cores in your machine, but you have a bunch of directories with a single file in it, you're only ever going to max out your number of cores on how many files are in that directory, right? So so by having a directory with a bunch of files means you can process multiple, you can compile multiple files at a time as long as they're in the same directory with Make. With Ninja, the default build tool under Mason, the build system we're using now in Pidgin 3, that's not a thing. Mason works at a project level, and it'll just figure out what needs to be built as a dependency, stuff like that, and it'll go and build it, and no matter where its sources are, it'll just work and do the right thing. So that speeds up builds ridiculously, and that makes things much easier. And so like we're not handicapped by putting things in subdirectories anymore by our build tool. So that's another reason why it's just yay, win for everybody, right? All right, next up, we removed Purple Tree and Purple Memory Pool. Now, if memory serves, these were originally added to help us support emoji support in Purple 3 and Pidgin 3. Except, I guess we deleted that code when we got rid of GTK IM HTML. And they're not used anymore. So we got rid of them. They were literally just sitting there adding to compile time and adding symbols into memory space that we didn't need. So we deleted them. The idea of using these for emoji isn't a bad one, but the emoji problem these solved is not the same emoji problem we have to solve today. So maybe these will make a comeback, probably not. But the emojis we're going to be doing in the future, the emoji problem is going to be very different. It's going to be most likely backed by SQLite, and we'll figure it out and go from there. Yeah. And then next up, we removed Null Client and the Null Protocol plugin. As you might guess by the names of Null, these didn't actually do anything. These were meant to be developer examples. So for those of you that don't know, and we really need to document this well in the future, Pidgin itself is just a UI built on top of a library rewrite called libpurple. Libpurple is the abstraction layer between all of the different chat networks and user interfaces. So then we also have a protocol plugin, which is an implementation of a chat network, which builds upon the abstraction from libpurple, and then libpurple will allow the UI to interact with the protocol via abstractions, right? So the idea of the Null client was to have an example client so that people could build their own UIs. The problem is nobody ever really maintained the Null client, and there wasn't really any documentation with it. There's some code comments around it, but like it wasn't even really functional. Like it would write to a terminal kind of functional. So what I want to do in the future, this will probably be after Pidgin 3 is released, is we're going to sit down and actually like document how to build a front end to libpurple. There are a number of front ends that are out there, right? We provide Pidgin and Finch. Although we don't talk about Finch much because Finch isn't really our main focus, which if anybody's interested in helping with that, please get in touch. But Finch is our terminal-based chat client. Again, it's built on libpurple. It's just a UI built on top of libpurple, and it works. There's also, we also had a Summer of Code project that expanded on some previous work from way before called Quail, which somebody is currently looking at possibly picking up and working on again. And that's a Qt-based front end, right? So, that would feel more native in a KDE environment rather than Pidgin, which, being a GTK application doesn't exactly feel right in a Qt environment. But whatever. And then like ADM has used libpurple. Also Bittleby, the IRC gateway, has support for libpurple. Instant Bird, which was part of Thunderbird, used libpurple. And there's another one I'm forgetting right now. There's a new chat application whose name I can't remember because they changed it. That was just built for Haiku OS, that they did as part of summer code for this year. So there's a bunch of UIs floating around, right? And it's not that it's impossible to do, but it's just totally not documented. And the null client wasn't making it easier, and it was just becoming a drain on us having to update it when we're making bigger changes, stuff like that. So in the future, plan is to go through and document all that and make it easier to understand. All right, and now when it comes to the null protocol plugin, likewise, it was a very similar setup. So protocol plugins can be very confusing to implement. We've been doing a lot of work in Purple 3 to make this easier. We've potentially created a little bit more work for the developer, but it should be a lot easier to follow and understand and structure your code. So that's a trade-off we've made here. But similar to the null client, the null protocol plugin didn't actually do anything. It was really just stubs and stuff like that for you to maybe get started with it. And that's not great, right? Not great at all. So by happenstance, we started creating the demo protocol plugin a while ago, for a number of reasons, least of which was to give us stable data to make screenshots for. But then we realized that the demo protocol plugin is actually a much better example protocol plugin than the null protocol plugin ever was. Because like the demo protocol plugin actually adds people to your contact list. They have statuses. You can send messages, right? And it does all of that without actually using a network connection. So, we keep the networking out of it because it's a demo, right? There doesn't need to be network. Everything's scripted. And then that way, you get a much better actual example than a bunch of stubs would give you. Likewise, we do plan on doing better documentation at some point. I'm going to be putting some together at some point. I've talked to Ian Robb. Ian Robb, for those of you that don't know, he writes probably the majority of our protocol plugins right now. And with everything we've been changing in Purple 3, I reached out to him a while ago and I was like, hey, would you like a tour of the protocol changes, the protocol plugin changes to Purple 3? He's like, yes. So I need to figure out exactly how we're going to do that and what that's going to entail. But we still need to finish finalizing those structures. We're getting close, I think. At least for what's there. I mean, we don't have all the new stuff, like emojis need to be finished, stuff like that. We'll probably put together some series of videos or something to walk people through it and that kind of stuff, or at the very least some documentation, more so than just our API reference, because our API reference isn't bad, but it's really hard to understand API reference kind of things, right? Like having that example or that walkthrough makes it much easier to understand. Like the API reference should be just that, reference, right? It shouldn't be your getting started guide or something like that, right? So, all right, next up, I'm not on the right window. Modernization of Pidgin 3. So we finished porting to GTK4. That is the important thing. We started this in February and we finished it, was it September? I think it was early September, because it was about 7 months to go from no GTK4 to building and running on GTK4. as you can tell from the numbers, we definitely stepped up our game to get it close. It's definitely a momentum builder, right? You start seeing the end of I don't want to say the end of the project. You start seeing the end of your current project, right? Which is to get to GTK 4, and you get excited and you just want to get through, you want to power through and finish it up. That's basically what happened this quarter, which is good, because we really needed that momentum to get this going. And yeah. So yeah, when we get to the demo, it's not going to look a whole lot different because GTK 4 verse 3 doesn't look very different, but we've started adopting some more of the GTK 4 like standard widget layouts and stuff like that. So you're definitely going to see changes there. And one more thing, I meant to mention this before I move to this slide. If anybody has any questions, if you're thinking of if there's something I haven't covered, you can always type !ask to go ahead and ask your question, which I'll cover later, which I'll answer later, later in this presentation. But yeah. All right, aside from that, we also started a brand new IRC-v3 protocol plugin. So for everyone that's not following chat networks all the time, I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to do that at all. IRC-v3 is the result of people trying to modernize the IRC protocol. Many people hear of IRC and they're like, oh, that's that old chat thing that really sucks. IRC-v3 is trying to fix all that. So they're adding all sorts of crazy support for all sorts of things. For example, I'm probably going to misquote this. No, so they're adding IDs to messages so that you can go ahead and edit messages, respond or reply to messages and stuff like that. All of that is being designed and documented, and that is part of the IRC-v3 protocol. On top of that, they also have vendor-specific extensions you can do and stuff like that. So like you hear all the time that people are like, oh yeah, Twitch chat, it's just IRC. It's not just IRC. It's specifically IRC-v3 with a bunch of vendor extensions. Twitch only supports like 11 out of the like 40 or something RFC commands, according to RFC 1459. I think that's right. But that's the original IRC specification. So like Twitch is Twitch does technically implement IRC, but it's IRC-v3 and it's only a subset. And then many things are vendor extensions built on top of it. But we're trying to support IRC-v3 as a new protocol plugin for a number of reasons. Number one, we've learned the hard way that trying to retrofit things into our soon-to-be 24-year-old code base ends up with a lot of work. Number one, you've got to fully understand the code. You sometimes have to refactor it to get it into a more pliable form before you can actually write the implementation. Then you write the implementation and you didn't fully understand something, so then you have to go back and update another thing. It's a real drag. So for IRC-v3 support, instead of updating the existing plugin, we started from scratch. This affords us many things, least of which being that this is now the first protocol plugin that has been code reviewed 100%. For those of you that don't know, we didn't start actually doing code reviews on the project until 2016. Before that, when people that hadn't earned developer status yet, they would be given they would submit code to our issue or patches to our issue tracker or email, and people would review them and then apply them. That was the majority of the code review. But anybody who had achieved developer status, they could just commit freely to the repository. As you may have guessed, that leads to a lot of tech debt. And that's a lot of what we've been working on lately, is trying to clean up, is that kind of stuff. So by having a protocol plugin that's been reviewed start to finish, we're hoping to avoid a lot of that. Excuse me. But yeah, so that's in progress right now. I was hoping to demo part of it today, but it turns out we just broke it the other day and we didn't notice it because I thought I tested part of it, but we didn't. But so far, it can connect to an IRC-v3 server. It'll respond to pings and pongs, so it'll keep itself alive the entire time. and it was able to receive messages until I just changed something on Monday. So I can't actually demo that today, but it's getting there. It's getting there. So, all right, next up. We started porting to GU PNP, but then we discovered it doesn't support Windows at all. GU PNP is a library that's under the GNOME Foundation for supporting universal plug and play. Now, Pidgin uses universal plug and play as well as NatPMP, Stun, and I feel like I'm missing something. I think Turn as well, but this isn't necessarily in the same regards, to do stuff for NAT traversal. And we do that NAT traversal so that we can support peer-to-peer file transfers, right? So like if you, on older protocols like IRC, I don't want to say XMPP has support for it, but also support for using third-party servers and stuff like that. But like a lot of stuff when you want to send a file just between two people, you just negotiate a connection between you and then you go. The problem is when you have NATs in the way, you need to get ports forward and stuff like that. This is all networking stuff most people don't care about, but yeah. But anyway, so we historically have had UPnP support via, I think it was a summer code student that actually wrote it. But what this does is this allows Pidgin to determine or to ask your router, in most cases, what your external IP address is, and then to ask your router to forward a port on the router to your machine. And then so then a protocol can use that to open up a port to you and then tell the other side, hey, connect to me to get this file. And say, here's my IP address, here's the port, and then it'll go. So we started porting to GUPnP because we're trying to stop maintaining the code like that, right? The reason for that is it's not our forte. We're not really experiencing it, stuff like that, right? And we'd be better off offloading that to somebody else than handling it ourselves. However, when we merged it, we made an assumption that they were using GSocket. GSocket has an abstraction layer between different socket types. The sockets are how you actually connect to different computers over the network, blah, blah, blah. And we had made an assumption that they were using GSocket, which has an abstraction between Windows and the rest of the world. But it doesn't. So when we merged it, all of a sudden our Windows build started failing because we didn't test it directly, because we don't want to test Windows directly, which is why it's on a build agent, but that's another story. So this caused a dilemma for us, right? The question became, we'll touch a little bit more on this later, but the question became, how do we go forward with this? And that's something we're going to talk about later. Actually, it's the next slide. So we'll just leave that for there. All right, so the next thing is we started the Contact Manager API. So the Contact Manager API is meant to replace the existing Buddy List API. That's your contact list that holds all your groups, your chats, your meta contacts, and your actual buddies, or the way you talk to people, as well as the Chat Buddy API. The Chat Buddy API was really an attempt to try to solve an attempt to try to make things a little bit easier to deal with when it comes to people that aren't on your contact list that you are in a chat room with. And it's also meant to replace various places where just a username was passed around. Places like that would be like if somebody you don't know sends you an instant message or a direct message, we just pass the username around, which isn't horrible, but it makes things very complicated. So the Contact Manager API, what it does is it adds so we renamed the existing Purple Contact to Purple Meta Contact to just kind of get it out of the way because we wanted to use that name in the Contact Manager API. So a Purple Contact is basically a representation of anybody that you can contact or that is contactable, right? So like anybody that's here in the Twitch chat, every single one of you, even if we're not friends, even though Twitch got rid of friends, right? Even if you're not on my contact list, you would have a contact inside of, you will now have a contact inside of Purple 3. And the reason for that is, like, if you were to DM me or something like that, I can then keep track of your presence to see, oh, okay, now you've gone idle, now you haven't, or whatever, right? And we can keep track of all that because of the contact, because of Purple Contact. Whereas before, if we just had a username, we would have to keep asking the service, what's their status, blah, 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 right? But more importantly than that is many, many, many new and existing chat networks, they don't pass around a username anymore, right? They give you an ID for the user. So what ends up happening is, so the way that many of the protocol plugins solve this is they either keep their own internal cache, which is a real pain in the butt to do, or they just add everybody they see to the buddy list, which then pollutes your buddy list with a ton of people, just so that they can keep a cache of usernames and IDs, right? Because when a new message comes in, it'll say it's from user with an ID, and it won't have a name. But inside the Purple API, it currently, as we're still transitioning to the Contact Manager API, you have to give the name, the username, because that's what's going to be used to be displayed in the UI. By creating a data structure or collection inside of libpurple, which is what the Contact Manager does, it's a collection of contacts. The protocol plugin just be like, hey, I got a message from this person. Do you know about them by ID? And they go, no. Okay. And then they go, okay, let me go look up all that data. And then here's all that info about them. And then here's a message from this person, from this contact, right? Because now we have a data set that we can just look up and cache all this. And it's in one place, and it'll be serialized to disk. So we avoid making extra API requests, stuff like that, to fill it in. So that's the idea of the Contact Manager API. We have the Contact Manager done. We have contacts done. We're still working through how people are going to work, Purple persons. Those are going to be what is now a Purple meta contact. So a person has multiple contacts, right? So like I have a Twitch account, I have an XMPP account, I have an IRC account, right? So we would take all of those 3 Purple contacts and associate them with the Purple person that is me. And then that way, you know, if somebody wants to message me, they can just say, hey, go message Gary, and then figure out whichever one is available and then send a message to it, right? And that's how the person stuff needs to work. We don't have that completely fleshed out yet, but we're getting there, right? That's the idea. So, all right, moving on. We updated the account editor window to be based on GTK listbox. So the account editor window used to be a tab or a notebook widget, a set of different tabs at the top, and it was kind of hard to follow, kind of hard to understand how to read, stuff like that. Moving it to GTK listbox, it's one list. All the different controls are in there. It seems easier to work with, but I'm not a UX person. And yeah, so that's one of our post GTK4 updates, which we'll see in the demo in a little bit here. So yeah, that's more just, modernizing, making things look consistent, and more of what people are expecting in 2022. Next up, we added a require password account option for protocols that have optional passwords. That is a mouthful, and let me explain why it is necessary. So when we created the Credential Manager API, that is how we now manage credentials, right? Your passwords and stuff, we don't manage them anymore. You either have to type them in every time, or you will store them in a credential provider. Something like libsecret or KWallet on Linux, Keychain Access on Mac OS, or WinCred on Windows. And the problem with that was previously, before the Credential Manager existed, in the account editor, there was a field for the password for an account. So whether or not a password was, so if a password was optional, we would just test to see if that password was an empty string or null. And if it's not there, then we don't have a password, right? The problem is when we offload that to a third party, in this case being any of the credential providers, we don't know if the password not being in the password manager or in the credential provider, we don't know if it not existing there is because you deleted it or you don't have it stored, right? Or, you know, you have it stored, or we would, if it was stored, we would get it back, right? So like we don't know when it's optional if you want to provide one or not. So we added a new option in the account editor that explicitly tells us require password. So what happens is during the login process, one of the first things we do in the login process is we go and ask the credential provider for your password. So what happens now with protocols that have an optional password, if you say require, or so for ones that had an optional password, we would look it up, and if we didn't get one back, we'd just continue, right? So now what happens is if it has an optional password and we look it up and we don't find one, we then check that setting to be, okay, do we require a password? And if it says yes, then we prompt the user for the password, right? So the user still has the option during that prompting to save the password in the credential manager or not, or in the credential provider or not. But this just, you know, makes that flow work so that things that have optional passwords work. So protocols that have optional passwords are like IRC. So like if you're just joining a network for the first time and you don't have NICServe or anything set up, you can just connect without a password, right? You just fine. You just say, this is going to be my username and we're going to go from there, and that's fine. Nobody cares. But if you are registered with NICServe and you have an account and all that, you want to use your password so that you can use your normal username and stuff like that, right? So that's the main reason for it, is so we can do that. And then we also need that for the IRC-v3 protocol plugin, because that will have optional passwords because of the reasons I just described. But once we implement SASL and all that, which is one of our next things to do on IRC-v3, we need to be able to know when the user wants us to make sure that they're using a password. So yeah. All right, next up, we started adopting G settings. We have converted all plugins and we have started libpurple for this port. G settings is going to replace our preferences API. Our preferences API, it's not bad, but it's one of those things where glib, a library we already use, has G settings, which does all this in a standard way that is more robust than what ours does. So our preferences API just saves everything to a file in the purple config directory or in the config directory for the application. Whereas G settings has multiple different backends. If you wanted to, on Windows, you can then store all our settings in the registry. There's some other backends I can't think of right now, but like also one of the things we just implemented recently is a unit test. They set up the test UI, and the unit test sets up the G settings. Sets up G settings to use a memory backend so that like your local install won't affect the unit test, and the unit test won't affect your local install and stuff like that, right? These are fun problems you get into as you're building a desktop application. But so we get to use all the same tools and everything that any GTK or glib-based application, including all in GNOME, is already using and capable of, and it's something we just don't have to maintain. And it also integrates pretty well. A G settings object is a G object, which means you can bind a property of a setting, or you can bind a setting to a property of another widget. So at some point, what we'll probably do with the preferences window is like all we'll really have to do is define the UI and then bind properties to it, and that's it. It's just like, okay, yep, the whether or not they want to do, I'm trying to think of an example in preferences. I got nothing right now. Wow. Oh, no, yeah, that's fine. Oh, yeah, no, we already have this set up, right? So there's a preference option for which credential provider to use. We don't have a getter or setter on it when the event changes anymore because it's just bound to the G settings object. So the purple credential manager exposes a settings object, which is has a schema of which one is the active provider. And then when you change it in the UI, it just tells, since the property is bound to the settings object gets updated, it writes out the file, and we don't have to write any code handling that. Because we just bound the property to the settings and we're done, right? So that's a win all around. It's less code we have to do. It's much easier to deal with. All right, and then last but not least, we fixed the transparency plugin, and we got it working on all operating systems. So the transparency plugin formerly was just a Windows only plugin that would use some GDI Plus API to make your windows transparent, or not fully opaque. So like you could see through them to see your application that the window is covering and stuff like that. Like I said previously, this only worked on Windows because we needed GDI Plus to do it, and there wasn't really a way to do it reasonably in X at the time. But now with your modern compositors on Linux, GTK has support for this out of the box in GTK 4. So now the transparency plugin works on all operating systems, because GTK 4 really requires you to have a compositor, which you already have on Mac and Windows. On the Linux side, you can get a easy compositor if you need one, and it'll just do the right thing and go from there. So that's very cool, and works pretty well. So, yeah. All right. Again, just a reminder, if anybody has any questions on what I mentioned here, and it's very possible we missed something that changed in this quarter. Like you all saw, we did basically twice as much work this quarter as we did in previous ones. So if you have any questions, by all means, just type !ask, and we will get to that after the presentation. So, all right, next up, first-party libraries. So, as I mentioned earlier, at least gplugin and Talkatoo are libraries we write to make things easier for ourselves and that we think might be useful to others in the future. So Talkatoo being our chat widgets, because we got everything moved to GTK 4 and Talkatoo is now GTK 4, we released it for the first time as version 0.1.0. This is definitely not a 1.0 release. We are not guaranteeing any API stability, which is why it is version 0.1, right? Not 1.0. Talkatoo's future of being a standalone library is still in question. There's some major issues that are brought up by the emoji problem, so Talkatoo is a GTK based application right now. We could split it into two parts, so it has a UI for GTK and a separate one that doesn't use, a separate core library that doesn't use GTK, to maybe clean up some stuff in libpurple. But because it's just GTK right now, we end up with some weird abstractions to make things work right with it. And the emoji problem is just going to exacerbate that problem. So this has us questioning whether or not Talkatoo is going to continue on as its own standalone library or not. But we're getting there, right? We'll figure that out and go from there. Aside from that, we released gplugin 0.38.1. I meant to look this up and I totally forgot to do it, on what exactly changed. This was more GTK 3 support stuff, or sorry, GTK 4 support stuff, and stuff to go from there. But yeah, gplugin had support for both GTK 3 and GTK 4, because and those are separate libraries as part of gplugin, because gplugin doesn't necessarily need GTK. It provides some simple widgets for displaying which plugins are available and their preferences and stuff like that, right? Or an info about them and that kind of stuff. So, all right. So we also started a new library called Traversity. So I mentioned earlier on the maintainability page about on a previous page about the GUPNP problem. So we created this new library called Traversity to abstract all of our NAT traversal methods into a single library using gsocket. Again, gsocket already does the abstraction across platforms, so we don't have to worry about the differences between BSD sockets and Linux and WinSock. We can just use gsocket; it'll work everywhere. So one of the things we ran into, or one of the things that pushed this decision really was, so if we were going to update GUPNP to either use gsocket or to just support WinSocket somehow, right? That's a non-trivial amount of work. And more to the point, because we still need to support NAT, PMP, PCP, stun, turn, etc. Right? These are all different ways to traverse NATs and to establish connections between two peers. We were still going to have to create an abstraction layer, right? So inside of Lit Purple, we were going to have to create an abstraction layer so that protocol plugins should just be like, hey, I don't care what the user's network is that I'm on. I just need to forward a port, right? So we're still going to have to create that abstraction layer. So by looking at that abstraction layer, as well as, we kind of had that abstraction layer already, but it needed improvement. Let's go with that. So looking at, okay, well, we have to redesign this abstraction layer, and we're going to have to do this non-trivial amount of work to GU PMP. Why don't we just take our existing code, put it into a new library, because clearly this problem could use a hand, right? Just in general, and go from there. And that's where we started with Traversity. So Traversity is still very early in its development. We don't have anything working yet. We have UPnP sending a request for UPnP version 1 to get the gateway device that typically your router, when you're behind a NAT, you've got a router in front of you that we call that the internet gateway device, or the IGD. So we've got it sending that, and I see the request coming back in on the wire, but I haven't implemented that part yet. Actually, no, I think I implemented reading, but I'm not processing it yet. But it turns out the way that I initially imagined the API would work didn't. So we had to go back and change that. And we recently merged that. And so now we have to go back and update the UPnP implementation to use the new API and go from there. And it's going to be some trial and error. But basically what we're doing is we're taking what we had for the existing code in Pidgin 3 and Pidgin 2. And we're going to use that to bootstrap this library to get it going. And then we'll go through and update stuff from there. One of the bigger issues is UPnP2 or IGD2 API has added a lot of security stuff and makes things a lot more robust. And reading through those specs is a challenge. And implementing them is going to be just as much of a challenge. But we're going to get through that and go from there. But like I said, right now we're probably just going to implement things as they exist today, just to get that transition done and going, so we can fix our Windows builds, and then we'll worry about updating them later. So that's the plan there. All right, setbacks. Everybody, setbacks. So, as I mentioned, we started porting to GUPMP, but realized too late that it has 0 Windows support. Yep, so our solution, create a new library. Not something we really want to do, but, you know, what can you do? Aside from that, there's been a thing on here for a while that says I haven't been able to get as much time as I want into Pidgin. This quarter I did. And as you saw, we did at least double the amount of work with me working pretty much full-time on Pidgin. However, I'm almost out of funds. Actually, I will run out of funds next month. So that means I need to find a contract or get a job or get a full-time job, something like that, right? Which means I'm not going to have as much time for Pidgin. So it sucks, but that's the state of things. If you know anybody that is looking for people to do contract work or wants to donate to the project, or, you know, give us a grant, anything like that, please reach out to me, either here on Twitch or you can find all my social media stuff at reaperworld.com, or look me up on LinkedIn, you'll find me. So yeah, if you have any leads, please get in contact. So aside from that, we still didn't finish the OAuth helper plugin. Previously, I thought it was because I had it documented as GIO streams aren't well documented. It's actually GIO channels, because they've been replaced by GIO streams. I looked at it once or twice during this quarter, didn't really get anywhere because the problem's dumb and I still don't understand what's happening. But also with the big push for GTK4 and Pidgin 3, we just didn't really look at Pidgin 2 at all. I'm hoping we can get through this for Q4. So we can get Pidgin 2. 14.11 out, or we might call it 2.15.0 with this plugin. We haven't decided that yet. Because this plugin is a real quality of life improvement for users. Right now, logging into like Google Chat and stuff requires like going to pulling the OAuth token out of the browser, and it's not good. It's not fun. So yeah. All right, who's ready for a demo? Also, we still don't have any questions. I can't believe we don't have any questions yet. Please, please, please ask your questions. All right, for the demo. All right, so I already have Pidgin 3 running. Last time I didn't have this running. So Pidgin 3 looks pretty much like you would expect it, pretty much like you expect Pidgin 2 to look. We're gonna just do this separately for a second here. So contact list window, we'll just start. We don't really have an onboarding process built yet. We're going to, as we get towards the betas. We're not really worried about it as we're going right now. Right now, we're just trying to get a lot of work done. We're not working on the user experience so much. We're focusing more on the user experience of the individual widgets, not on a first run experience, right? So we're going to go ahead. We're going to add, so number one, you'll see this is the new account editor. Like I said, it's glistbox based, right? So you got your advanced options here that you can pull out. I know the alignment of these aren't right. We're going to be moving to libedwada 1.2 once Fedora 37 is released. And these inputs are all going to change to be a different setup. So bear with us. We're getting there slowly but surely, right? But yeah, so we're going to go ahead and add a demo thing. You'll also notice one of the nice little touches we've added now is instead of just getting the name of the protocol, you get a little description about them, right? So I can't tell you how many times we've had somebody come in on IRC and be like, what is bonjour? What's gadu gadu, right? So now it's just built in the UI. Bonjour, it's a serverless protocol for local networks. Maybe that satisfies them, maybe it doesn't. I don't know, right? But this gives us at least some way to give them some info, and we can always improve these descriptions later, right? The fact that they're here will, drive feedback, which then we can, act upon. But yeah, so anyways, we're going to go ahead. You see, this is everything we're supporting in Pidgin 3 right now. There is discussion about, or before 3.0 is released, we're probably going to pull out all of the proprietary stuff. It's not that we're getting rid of it. It's that, I've talked about this before, but we'll mention it now real quick. We have had contributors who have had to stop working on the project because their employer was not comfortable with them working on a code base that has gray area code, like Pidgin, right? So like Facebook, actually I think GroupWise was actually all open source development, but Facebook, same time, those were all reverse engineered and, implemented to make things go, right? What ended up happening is, if you have to pick between your job or the open source project you work on, which one are you going to pick, right? So we end up losing those contributors because what happens, right? All that free time they had to work on that open source project, they find something else to fill it with, and they just don't come back. So to avoid that problem in the future, the Pidgin repository itself will only have open source or open spec protocol support, but everything else will be available externally. We have some ideas on how to make it easier. We're just a long way away from that. But anyways, so we're gonna grab the demo protocol plugin. Usernames are still required. I want to get this fixed at some point, but we'll get it there at some point. But yeah, so we're just gonna hit save. So the demo protocol plugin, like I said, as an example protocol plugin, it does a lot more because, hey, look, people are online. We have account actions. We have all sorts of fun stuff. The contact list window, if you've used Pidgin 2, you'll notice it looks the same but different. One of the main things is the status bar or the status widget that was down here is now up here, because one of the things we're doing, and I mentioned, or we didn't get to that slide yet, but one of the things that we've mentioned in previous State of the Birds is we are working on making the contact list, trying to get it to the point where it's going to become part of this window, right? So right here, you see we have notifications and conversations. There's going to be one probably at the top that says contacts. And then you'll have something like this widget. We haven't quite figured it out yet, but we'll go. And we'll deal with that from there. But yeah. So next up is, you'll notice the menus are the same across both windows. We're now using the normal menu stuff for or the modern menu stuff. One of the benefits this gets us is this makes us look like a native Mac application, because our menus then show up at the top menu bar like you would expect on Mac. So that's good time. That's all fine. That's happy. All right, so next up, we have the notification system. Notifications are a little busted right now. There's a bug we have to fix. Actually, it's not so much a bug, it's more of an implementation detail. But what we'll do is to trigger one. So notification, or one of the other things is at the bottom of the contact list, between your contacts and the status picker, you would be shown any connection errors, any notifications, stuff like that. The problem is that all of that state was kept in the contact list window itself, which is problematic when we want to migrate that into this window, right? And more importantly, at some point, we're going to allow you to split conversations out of here and stuff like that, so that becomes a problem. But so what we're going to do is we're going to force a failure, right? So we're just going to try to connect to an IRC server that doesn't exist, right? And boom, there you go. Now I got your notifications. So, you know, this account was disabled, unable to connect, error resolving, irc.library.chat ASDF, name or service not known. Then from here, you can go ahead and modify the account, right? It's all nice, handy. You can re-enable it because you'll see it got disabled here. This isn't going to work right because of a bug we need to go and figure out. But then you can just dismiss the notification too, right? So notifications are going to support all sorts of stuff. File transfers, contact authorizations already in here. Oh, that would have been an easy one to show. But whatever, we'll do. Yeah, we can do that one real quick. Contact authorization request, file transfers. We're intending at some point to put mentions, right? So somebody mentions your name in a chat, something like that. Then possibly reaction, stuff like that when we get to there. Basically, this is the catch-all to like give you a bird's eye view of what's going on. We are going to put little badges here. This widget needs to be swapped out. This is a transitional widget to get us to GTK4 because the widgets we want to use here were GTK4 only. So we had to, you know, build something that would get us to GTK4 so we can go back and fix it then. So, all right. One of the other things we mentioned was the credential manager. This window doesn't not full screen by default on a tiling window manager. That's another bug we got to worry about. Another problem for another day. So the preference window, you'll see this all is modern list-based widgets, right? Everything looks nice, fine, fancy, blah, blah, blah. All right, good. So we're already on libsecret. So credential providers, like I mentioned earlier, you can select libsecret and stuff will just work. So we're on libsecret. What we can do is I have an XMPP account that should be stored in the password manager. So that is merg@pidginchat.com, and the resource is pidgin3devenv. I see, here's that require password option. Passwords are optional in XMPP because of some SASL setup or something. It's weird and funky. I'm not exactly clear on it, but yeah. Oh, one of the other things you'll mention is, or you'll notice is, while the descriptions show up here in the menu, they don't show up here. So now it's just XMPP, and then you're like, oh, okay. Extensible messaging presence protocol for IM, voice, and video. Oh, cool. Nice, right? All right, we'll go ahead and hit save. And why does this keep happening? This isn't supposed to happen, is the problem. Like, it should be pulling out of the password manager, and I don't remember why it's not working. But that's, whatever, that's a bug for another day. Or did I? No, yeah, we should have hit that, whatever. All right, so anyways, I just pulled that out of my password, out of my regular password manager. All right, hold on, copy that. Okay, so now we see grummanimfreedom.org is on, right? But we are going to remove them so that I can show the contact authorization. we're going to add merg at pidginchat.com. Then sure. So there we go, right? So when you get a contact authorization request now, again, you can just ignore it. You can hit the message button, which will boop, open up a message to them. We can say, who this, right? And say, I'm you, dummy. Right? Okay, that's another bug we have to deal with. Said, not ready for end users. But we're getting there slowly, right? But yeah, so we can go back to the notifications. We can deny the authorization request, or we can just hit accept. And then we can add the buddy to our list. We're add to group testing, right? Then over here, I've got that, which should authorize, right? And, you know, there's the notifications. Nice, easy to work with, easy to deal with. So, yeah. So conversations, like I said, what we'll do is we'll grab, so in the demo protocol plugin, we have this echo user, which will echo everything. Oop, this echoes everything I say. And this is just, you know, mostly to give us a test kind of thing, how the messages work, that kind of stuff. And yeah, obviously this needs a lot of work yet, a lot of cleanup. This is, it's functional. It's not pretty. We're getting there, one thing at a time kind of thing, right? What else do we want to cover? We did the account editor. The menu stuff is all pretty much the same. The about window looks nice and fancy. This is probably gonna get overhauled soon. We had the idea, well, ooh, that's fun. We had the idea a while ago that we need to go through and implement that. We should probably put the changelog embedded in the application, and we'll get to that too. But we're just starting to look at that kind of stuff. Debug window looks the same. We're probably going to clean this up, change it up somehow. Not sure how yet, but we'll see. But one of the other fun parts is, since we're using Libid Water for everything, we can do fun stuff like prefer dark theme. And voila, now the application is just dark. We're going to work this into the preferences. We need to create like a general preferences tab. That's going to have options for, so like on Windows, you're not going to have, well, like, so I'm using the GTK inspector, which is a development tool, to flip it right now. It's supposed to detect what your desktop environment is, and it does work correctly on Mac. I haven't tried it on Windows in a while. But since I'm running i3 and I'm not really running like GNOME or anybody else that implements that spec, nothing detects that it should be in dark mode for me. So I have to manually trigger it. But we're going to add a general settings page, or the preference page, right? So right now we have conversations, network, proxy, blah, blah, blah. We're going to add a general. On the general page, there's going to be an option for, you know, prefer dark mode or use dark mode. And then we're also going to have a local alias for all your accounts by default thing. We're going to, one of the things you may have noticed is there's the only way to set your global avatar in Pidgin 2 was next to the status bar in the contact list, and that widget went away. So right now there's no way to actually do that. So that's also going to go into the general page. These are just things that need to get done. We haven't gotten to them yet, right? This is not a huge deal. We've got big underlying APIs to go and clean and update. So those things will probably come later. But yeah. So I think that pretty much covers it. I wanted to demo at least receiving on the IRC-v3 thing, but like I said, that's broken and doesn't work right now. But yeah, so that pretty much covers the demo. So if anybody has any questions, again, exclamation point ask. And we will get your questions in a moment. So, all right, next up, what are the next steps for the project? In other words, what are we going to handle in the next quarter? So, between now and the next Day of the Bird, which is January 19th, I think was the date, we're going to continue the convergence of the contact list and the conversation window. That's where the contact list goes into the conversation window, right? Like I said, this all depends on the contact manager API. We don't necessarily have to get everything going, but we have to figure out how the purple person stuff is going to work exactly, and get that going and finish that part. We tried migrating the existing contact list into the conversation window, and it wasn't going to be easy. I mean, I wasn't expecting it to be easy, but it was going to be way harder than I anticipated it was going to be. And we already knew we were going to rewrite that entire underlying API. So it's just like, well, why don't we just do the rewrite and then build the UI on top of the new stuff? Rather than, again, trying to retrofit something that is just, you know, never meant for it. All right. So next up, one of the next things we need to get through to is we need to finish integrating the history API. The history API was written by a summer code student last year. What it does is it basically serializes all of your messages, right? It keeps track of all of your history. So historically, in Pidgin 2 and earlier, history was basically written to a flat text file, which means while we could technically look up history and search through it, we couldn't actually find a message, right? So like, this is one of the big problems we have in Pidgin 2, and one of the reasons why we can't really upgrade Pidgin 2 to support message editing and stuff, is it was never ever designed for message editing. There's no indice, there's no way to find a message by ID or anything. It just doesn't exist. So the history API was built to fix all that. Now, the history API that we have in place right now is much more of a proof of concept. It definitely works and it's functional, but it's not complete. And for us to get to anywhere near for us to get Pidgin 3 anywhere near a daily driver, the history API needs to be completely functional. So that means like, one of the things we got rid of from Pidgin 2 is we no longer will have a history viewer, because if you want to search for the history, you'll just open the conversation as a normal conversation window, and then either via searching or by scrolling, you will just be able to go and see all of the history. And so that's very important for the history API to be there. And we also need the history API to handle everything else, including reactions, replies, redactions, that's deleting messages, threads, all of that. Anything that mentions an existing message that was already sent, we need the history API for that. And that needs to be complete and working properly. So that's one of our high priority things, is because guess what? History is really important in a messaging client, the history of the messages that came through. So that needs to get finished, that needs to be done and cleaned up, but we're getting there. So next up is creating the roadmap for 3.0.0 Alpha 1. So you heard me mention about what will it take to get to a daily driver. That's what 3.0.0 Alpha 1 is. How many alphas and how many betas are we going to have? How many release candidates are we going to have? I don't know. We're not targeting anything in specifically number-wise, but we are getting close to an alpha. So if we finish up the history API, we finish converting the contact list in the conversation window, we're doing some more cleanup right now when it comes to the way protocol plugins connect, stuff like that. As we start getting all of these things finished up and cleaned up, we're getting closer and closer to a stable interface for protocol plugins, which means the developers of external third-party protocol plugins should be able to start looking at Purple 3 and maybe start updating for them, which will obviously start as we start adding support for new features like, you know, replies, redactions, reactions, threading, all that stuff will really build a lot of momentum. And, you know, it'll really make Pidgin a competitor where it's been like, I don't know, it works, it gets the job done, but things could be a lot easier, right? So that's our goal. That's what we're trying to get to. So after that, our next, we're also going to be looking at Pidgin 2.14.11 or 2.15.0. Like I said, we're not sure which one we're going to do next, but we do want to get that the OAuth helper plugin released or done and into a release. so that we can provide a better experience for users there. And like we noticed earlier, there was 4 commits on Pidgin on the 2.x branch. I don't remember what they were. I think they were bug fixes for long outstanding issues that were non-critical, but it'd be nice to get those done and released, right? Then from the infrastructure side of things, we're gonna get our email migrated to a dedicated provider. We talked about that earlier. This will take a big burden off my shoulders and something I will not have to worry about anymore, which will be amazing. And then we're going to stand up Discourse and import our mailing list users into it. We're going to provide, I don't know the terminology right, but areas in Discourse. We're going to create them for each of our existing mailing list, and we're going to import the users. And then we're going to take our existing email archive and put that online somewhere and not import it to Discourse. I mean, we could, but it doesn't seem like there's a reason to. So, all right. Does anybody have any questions? This is why I keep telling people to ask questions, because now we're ready for your questions. And as of right now, we have no questions. So I'll give you all about a minute or so, and then we'll decide if we're figure out if we're gonna have any questions or not. Oh, one more thing to mention is I think this happened after October 1st. When I write the state of the bird, I try to do it up to just the quarter boundaries and not the stuff that's happened between now or between, you know, this beginning of the month and the actual presentation. But we're moving to SQLite for a lot of things. The contact manager is backed by SQLite. The history manager defaults to having a SQLite backend. So we recently wrote a very rudimentary SQL migration manager API into libpurple. So if there's any plugins using SQLite, they'll be able to use that too and everything too. But yeah. So, all right. Well, looks like we don't have any questions, so we can just skip on through. So closing notes. Again, just gonna mention that, you know, the amount of activity we saw this quarter is probably not gonna happen again, at least for a while. A big part of the reason why it happened was there was all the momentum around the GTK4 port. And it's not that we've lost that momentum, it's that it was very easy to find things to fix and go. And now we're back to the grind of, okay, we got a lot of big stuff to do, right? On top of that, I also did a streaming experiment where I streamed for over 30 days consecutively. So we were actively on stream working on Pidgin a lot during that. But again, as I obviously need to go find some way to continue funding my development of Pidgin, that's going to cut into time, right? So not only are we going to lose that, or not only are we going to lose time because of me not streaming as much and because we don't have the momentum of nearing the end of a big port, I'm going to be working more on other stuff that's not related. I'm going to be tireder, and it's going to push all the dates out for Pidgin 3, right? Unless we can find some funding. That, you know, by funding I mean grants, something like that, right? Something where I can keep Pidgin as a full-time, whereas a nearly full-time gig rather than just, you know, a side gig. So, aside from that, there's one other announcement I need to make today, which I've been holding back on for a long time because I wanted to document exactly how it should be done. But I haven't yet because I've been busy with the GTK4 stuff and everything else. But today we're going to announce that Ivanhoe is the first brand new crazy patch writer, or person being promoted to a crazy patch writer that we've had in a long time. So in the Pidgin project, in general, we have, I guess I'd call them three, I guess technically it's 4 tiers of contributors, right? You've got the random contributor, maybe a drive-by contributor that, you know, submits a patch every now and then, whatever, right? The next step from that is a crazy patch writer. A crazy patch writer is somebody who has definitely shown initiative in understanding and knowing the code base. They are willing to help support users and stuff like that, and just, you know, generally they bring a lot of positivity when it either comes to when it comes to development, community outreach, stuff like that. And Ivanhoe over the past couple of months has definitely shown that. And I told him a while ago that he was going to get the promotion. There's no extra expectation. There's no expectations out of getting the title change. The title's more just a recognition, right? It's just like, oh, okay, yeah, you've put in the work, you've put in the time. We understand that. Here's how it goes, right? We're an open source project. Sorry, I got no money to give you. I got no money to pay myself, right? But so after the crazy patch writer, you get developer status. Honestly, nowadays there's not much difference between a developer and a crazy patch writer. Previously, the difference before we were using code review and everything, the main difference was you would get direct commit access. But now developer just means it's like, all right, you know, help out with code reviews when you can. Same deal for crazy patch writers. But like developers, I would, you know, you'd expect them to be able to like solve problems by writing brand new APIs or, you know, other stuff like that, right? They're taking on more responsibility in that, right? And then the last tier is the lead developer / maintainer or whatever, which is the title I currently hold, which is I'm the one that's, you know, driving the vision forward of the project, trying to make sure the community is involved and that kind of stuff. So, apparently we never discussed this, but it ends up being that I'm also the one that ends up merging all the pull requests, which is fine, right? It's not a big deal. But yeah, so that's basically the structure of the project. So congratulations to Ivanhoe. I will get you updated in the Pidgin 2 code base under Crazy Patch Writers and Pidgin 3 and everything. And I got to fix, one of the reasons why I wanted to document all this is there's a bunch of places where I need to add that title too. So like you get added to a group in Hub, and I forget what else. But yeah, it's been long enough that I've been dragging my feet on, you know, actually announcing that and giving that out. So we're just going to go make it happen. So yeah. All right. So if there's no questions or anything else to talk about, I guess that's about it. We're going to get out of here. So yeah. All right. Well, until next time, adios.